The detailed version of that story comes from John chapter 4. We'll be reading this morning verses 3 through 30 and 39. So he, meaning Jesus, came to a Samaritan city called Sychar, near the plot of ground that Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired out by his journey, was sitting by the well. It was about noon. The Samaritan woman came to draw water, and Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink." His disciples had gone to the city to buy food. The Samaritan woman said to him, "How is it that you, a Jew, ask a drink of me, a woman of Samaria? Jews do not share things in common with Samaritans." Jesus answered her, "If you knew the gift of God and who it is that is saying to you, 'Give me a drink,' you would have asked him, and he would have given you the living water." The woman said to him, "Sir, you have no bucket, and the well is deep. Where do you get that living water? Are you greater than our ancestor Jacob, who gave us the well, and with his sons and his flocks drank from it?" Jesus said to her, "Everyone who drinks of this water will be thirsty again, but those who drink of the water that I will give them will never be thirsty. The water that I will give will become in them a spring of water gushing up to eternal life." The woman said to him, "Sir, give me this water, so that I may never be thirsty or have to keep coming here to draw water." Jesus said to her, "Go, call your husband and come back." The woman answered him, "I have no husband." Jesus said to her, "You're right in saying, 'I have no husband.' For you've had 5 husbands, and the one you now have is not your husband. What you have said is true." The woman said to him, "Sir, I see that you're a prophet. Our ancestors worshipped on this mountain, but you say that the place where you people must worship is in Jerusalem." Jesus said to her, "Believe me, the hour is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. But the hour is coming and is now here when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For the Father seeks such as these to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth." The woman said to him, "I know that the Messiah is coming, he who is called Christ. When he comes, he will proclaim all things to us." Jesus said to her, "I am he, the one who is speaking to you." Just then the disciples came. They were astonished that he was speaking with a woman, but no one said, "What do you want?" or "What are you speaking? Why are you speaking with her?" Then the woman left her water jar and went back to the city. She said to the people, "Come and see a man who told me everything that I've ever done. He cannot be the Messiah, can he?" They left the city and were on their way to him. Verse 39. Many Samaritans from that city believed in him because of the woman's testimony. "He told me everything I've ever done." This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Well, I want to play one of my favorite games with you. Where in the world is Jesus? Let's look at our map and figure out where he is. He's been down in the south in the region of Judea, and he's going back north to Galilee. And on that lower body of water, that kind of vertical body of water, that's the Dead Sea. And Jesus, to the left of that, is the region of Samaria. That blue shaded area, kind of to the north of that blue shaded area, is the region of Samaria. Now, in Jesus' time, of course, if you're going south to north or north to south, you can kind of go east of the Jordan River, or you can go west of the Jordan River. Now, the area east of the Jordan River is known as Gentile area. Those were people who were non-Jews. They were people who did not subscribe to the Jewish faith and worship of Yahweh. On the western side of the Jordan River, though, is that region, that area in the northern part of the blue shaded area known as Samaria. Now, it's bad enough that they had Gentiles on the east, but Samaritans were far worse in their mind, according to Jewish custom and understandings. Even though the route between the Samaritan route was a little bit shorter and meant that Jesus had to go through this area that was most despised by people of the Jewish faith, it was the shorter way home. And being that Jesus had been ministering and begun his ministry according to the Gospel of John, this is just after his encounter with Nicodemus in John chapter 3. Jesus is probably tired. He's got a long journey ahead of him. He's not going to get into his hybrid car and drive north to Galilee. He's going to have to make this trek on donkey or walking. And so he's got a long way to go. And so he decides to go through this despised area that is native to the Samaritan people. And so Jesus, of course, being on a long, hot journey in the Palestinian sun, seeks an area of respite, a time of respite where he can get a drink of water. And so I want you to keep all those things in mind, and we're going to shift gears a little bit, and we're going to introduce our poem for today, the Jack and Jill poem. Let's read that poem once more, if we can show it. Jack and Jill went up the hill to fetch a pail of water. Jack fell down and broke his crown, and Jill came tumbling after. Up Jack got, and home did trot as fast as he could caper. He went to bed to mend his head with vinegar and brown paper. Jack and Jill went up the hill to fetch a pail of water. Now, as I think about intersections between John chapter 4 and this poem, nursery rhyme poem, Jack and Jill, the first thing that I think about is not the characters named Jack and Jill, of course, but we have Jesus and an unnamed woman. So Jesus and she. According to tradition, this woman has, the Christian church has ascribed the name Fatina to this lady. So Jesus, not Jack and Jill, but Jesus and Fatina, according to tradition, not her real name, of course. She's unnamed, and rightfully so, based on her background that we'll get into in just a moment. They descend upon this well, and of course, for the people of Samaria, they would have had to have their habitation around a water source. When ancient civilizations were built, they depended, as I've told you, upon landscape for natural defenses and, of course, a water source. And they descend upon this water source located near Mount Gerizim. And Jesus does a significant thing. If we don't understand the background of the Samaritan people and the friction between the Jewish people and the Samaritan people, we miss the point of this story. But instead of Jesus falling down and breaking his crown, Jesus does something pretty spectacular. Jesus stoops down to the level of this woman, and rest assured, it was a big leap that he had to descend. By talking with this woman, and we'll explain why this is significant, Jesus begins to not ruin or break his crown, but he begins to reveal his crown. His crown as the King of Kings. His crown that signifies he would be the one to turn culture upside down and usher in a new era for all time. He reveals his crown and begins to have with this despised woman who is representative of a hated people, the longest conversation with any person in the New Testament that Jesus had. It happens right here at Sychar near Mount Gerizim with this woman at the well in John chapter 4. Now, why did Jewish people hate the Samaritans so much? Well, if you ask a Samaritan person, they understood themselves to be direct descendants of the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh. A couple points, if you want to go back and read Genesis chapter 48, you can get a little bit of history as to who they understood themselves to be. And they believed that, let's look at our pictures of Mount Gerizim. They believed that I know it's a little bit grainy, but in the upper left quadrant of the picture there, of the collage, that is Mount Gerizim as seen from another mountain nearby. And they believed that this was the holy place for their people. They believed that because of their descendants and because of earlier events in history, this was the place where they understood God to be worshipped. They believed that this was the mountain of covenant, and therefore as the true center of their worship. And they would later build a temple on Mount Gerizim that you see pictured in the upper left. And it was to this mountain that the Samaritan woman is offering her understanding and refers to when she speaks with Jesus. That was who they understood themselves to be. But friends, that is not at all according to the Jewish understanding of who the Samaritans were. If you ask a Jewish person during this time, they were just a half-breed of people, a mongrel people who were foreigners and had resettled in this land called Samaria. To the Jews, the Samaritan people, every one of them were unclean. And you know what a big to-do the Jewish people made about cleanliness and uncleanliness. I mean, there's a whole book of the Bible, Leviticus, dedicated to it almost. That's what I'm reading through right now. What a joy. But according to my New Testament professor that I had in the seminary, Craig Keener, he says that the Jewish people and the Samaritan people had the same God. They actually had the same God, but they despised each other for centuries. And so strike number one against this woman, she was a Samaritan. A half-breed of people that if she had to fill out a census in 2020, she would probably just have to say other. Other. Not only was this person a Samaritan, but we know that she was a female. She was a woman. Now, this is the second strike against her because the Jewish people frowned upon men speaking to women in public. It didn't matter if you were married to them. If you were a Jewish person, you would not dare speak to, at this time, when this occurred, you would not dare speak to a woman in public. In fact, if a man spoke to a woman in public, it was assumed that she had an improper relationship with that man. Now just keep that in mind as you think about what was going through the minds of the disciples. And saying either Jesus is not who we think he might be revealing himself to be, or we've had this thing all wrong. And we see this influence of women in history as early as the philosophers with the names of Socrates, Aristotle, and Plato. And they believed that women were just not equal to men. I'm not saying that that's my belief. I'm saying that's history, that it was passed down to the Jewish people. And because of this earlier understanding, we see cultures influence one another. And Jewish rabbis would in fact pray a prayer such as this. God, thank God I'm not a peasant, I'm not a Gentile, and thank God I'm not a woman. Can you imagine? Strike number two is that this Samaritan person was a woman. And as for her third strike against her, she, we find from this passage, had a colorful past. She had 5 husbands. And she reveals this to Jesus, and Jesus says, I know that, in fact, the person that you're living with is not your husband either. And Thomas Stegall says this about this woman. He says, this woman had been married and divorced so many times that she doesn't even bother with the ceremony anymore. Why bother? After 4 failed marriages, what does the covenant of marriage, as we understand it to be, what would that mean to her? What would it mean to her? Why bother? Just move in together. Now, I know it's more and more common in 2019, and that's a sermon for another day. But it was not at all common in her day and time. She was a Samaritan, she was a woman, and she had shacked up with her boyfriend. Thomas Stegall says, these are the reasons that she would have been ostracized. And not only would she have been ostracized by the Jewish people, but she would have been ostracized by the Samaritan women. That's when you know things are really bad. Strike number 3 is that this woman was living with an unmarried man. By all accounts, every cultural norm that they would have understood to be true and influenced their life, this lady was a lady not just living on the fringes of society. This lady was an outcast in every kind of way. If she had been voted in her high school class most likely to anything, she probably would have been voted most likely to die without any friends. But thanks be to God that she had one. And his name was Jesus. This woman who had no social interaction with the rest of society was about to have, do you realize this, the longest conversation in the New Testament. She goes from social nothing to a main role player in the longest conversation that's recorded in the New Testament. And Jesus risks his reputation that was beginning to develop for a lady who is on the outcasts of society. He would begin to get to know her story and listen to her understanding of her own story and begin to have a conversation with her. I think here in John chapter 4, we have an appropriate model for what discipleship and evangelism should look like. before we call somebody out and tell them they've had 5 persons, maybe we should have a long conversation with them and get to know who they are. Before we bring our judgment and our criticism about their lifestyle, maybe we should meet them at the well and say, I know that you're living on the outcasts of society, on the margins, on the fringes, but I come and meet you and stare you directly in the face. Other people had shunned her all of her life, but it was Jesus who changed the game and began to cherish her. And here we have this legacy, this story, this narrative that happened, that's passed down to us, where we realize the kingdom and Jesus, everything that the kingdom and Jesus stand for, mean that our society is forever challenged and our cultural norms and understandings are at risk of being turned upside down. And so what is it that Jesus talks to her about? He says, you know, this whole routine that you've been doing for weeks on end, you don't have to do it anymore. She's like, that'd be great. You know, I come here in the hot of the day. Most people come in the cool of the evening or the early morning hours, and no one talks to me. And whenever I come around, people keep their distance. And that's why I have to come here at noon, the hottest part of the day, because that's the only time made available to me. It'd be great if I didn't have to come to this well in the noon part of the day. It's hot. I'm reminded how isolated and alone I am. I hear, Jesus, that there's a time when people are going to hang around water coolers and talk and socialize, but that hasn't happened in my time yet. I feel so alone. I just wonder what Jesus' response, what he was thinking when he talked about that routine of coming and getting water. And he said, you know, daughter of God, darling, that's not really the routine I'm talking about. This routine of you living this colorful lifestyle, that's the routine I'm more interested in. It's less about physical nourishment and more about spiritual nourishment that I'm interested in. Because I know that you've had 5 husbands, and the one that you have now is not who you desire him to be. You've had 5+ men, and none of them have satisfied you. And ironically, you're now having an encounter with a man of a different kind. And whereas those 5 previous men in your life have left you wanting and lacking, they've left you emotionally lacking, they've left you spiritually drained, and the conviction upon yourself is just eating at your soul. There's one man of a different kind who's now standing before you, asking you for a drink of water. You see, all those 5 men in your life couldn't satisfy you. But there's a man before you who now can satisfy your every thirst, your every hunger, your longing for the rest of your life. There's a whole lot of sermons packed into this one, but I want us to realize that Jesus stooped down to this woman of a colorful past, the outcast of all outcasts. Jesus stooped down and revealed his crown and said, from now on, your life is going to be different because of this encounter with me. And so what did Fotina, or Jill, according to the nursery rhyme poem that we're examining today, what did Jill do? Well, she went tumbling after. Instead of tumbling after, as Jill did in the story, this lady that history names Fotina, of course, went babbling after to all the people of Samaria who had shunned her. And she begins to exclaim and proclaim this great news of this encounter of a man who finally changed her life. This is the man who made her feel different for the first time in her life. And she begins to tell the people of Samaria, those outcast people who themselves were fringe people in society. And she says that this man who I had an encounter with at the well, he told me my whole life story. I didn't tell him. He just knew it. He knew everything about me. And this woman who had been ashamed and embarrassed makes the transfiguration and becomes elated and outspoken. And she was head over heels, now in love with a new man of a different kind. A man who changed her soul and her inner peace. This woman at the well, according to John's gospel, we could say becomes the first evangelist in history. It's one of the reasons that I'm proud to be a Methodist. Someone in the tradition of John Wesley who understood the value of women in our society. And I don't think that there's anything we should be ashamed of by putting women in the pulpit. Because the first woman who would have been in a pulpit of her own kind was this woman on Mount Gerizim. And from that mountaintop and to the people of Samaria, she wanted to shout and say, I've seen Jesus. I've seen this man who is the Messiah and claims himself to be. We're told that many people in Samaria made a response to this woman. They realized that her story was true. She hadn't really divulged everything about her story to this time, but people knew. And for some reason, this time when she was revealing her story in this new chapter in her story, they believed her and she had credibility for the first time in her life. And they wanted to go back to Jesus and figure out where this happened and have a face-to-face encounter of their own with this same person named Jesus. And the Samaritans, we are told, would believe because of the most unlikely witness in all of the New Testament. This lady at the well. And verse 39 sums it up so well. We're told that the Samaritan people from that city, because of the woman's testimony, came to believe. Because of her. Not necessarily because of Jesus first and foremost, but because of the woman. Whatever you see yourself to be in the spiritual legacy of those who follow Christ, I want you to imagine yourself as equally important as this woman. You have a story worth sharing. And if you feel like you exist in the shadows, it's not as bad as the life that this woman led. We're not as estranged as this woman would have been. And yet it was because of this woman and her story that a whole town came to know and encounter Jesus. And so I offer you a variation of Jack and Jill. This is an original variation that I offer to you. This is how I understand John chapter 4 and events that would follow leading up to Jesus' death and crucifixion and resurrection. Jesus and a woman went to the well. It should be to the well, to fetch a pail of water. Christ stooped down and revealed his crown, and she went rejoicing after. Up Christ got, north did trot, intentionally as he could be. He went back south to save the lost, where vinegar soaked a wooden cross. And so I conclude this morning by asking a few questions of myself. You may want to write these down. You may want to ask these of yourself. If you feel like you don't need to ask yourself these questions, that's fine. You can just pray for your pastor. First question is this. Am I more bound to cultural norms or Jesus norms? Am I more bound to cultural norms or Jesus norms? Secondly, am I more likely to talk about someone or talk to someone? Am I more likely to talk about someone or to someone? And finally, where is the well that Christ has revealed to me?